a wise yet maverick Jedi Master who carved his own path in the Force and served as the catalyst to the dealings of the galaxy for nearly 70 years. He fundamentally altered the very idea of what a Jedi was and what they were capable of, simply by trusting in the Force. He was a man who suffocated under the weight of his family's legacy, and was filled with the same raw power that could once more reshape the entire galaxy. His final moments marked a peaceful end to his complex bloodline, and reaffirmed that the light would always prevail against the dark. If the two were forced into a battle against one another, who would come out on top? This is the topic for this edition of the Star Wars Lads Versus series, Episode 3, Qui-Gon Jinn vs. Kylo Ren. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Star Wars Lads Versus series. This was the first matchup that took me a while to pick, but I think it's also the most important and undeveloped relationship in the entire saga. It was Qui-Gon's belief in the complex truths of the old Jedi prophecies that actively resulted in the rapid ascension of the Skywalker clan to galactic status, and such actions effectively burdened a young Ben Solo with a legacy that left him with the misguided belief that he had to kill his past in order to move beyond as Kylo Ren. Had Qui-Gon survived his duel with Darth Maul, Anakin Skywalker could have followed the call of the cosmic and living force alongside an adaptable mentor, fulfilling his destiny in a more beneficial way to his own well-being and that of the entire galaxies. Because Qui-Gon did fall, Anakin was doomed to follow an alienating Jedi dogma that was subservient to a crumbling galactic republic, and whose deceptive leader shaped much of the thinking and emotions of the isolated man as he grew older. And yet, if not for Qui-Gon training Obi-Wan Kenobi, Darth Vader could have taken over the entire galaxy and become the ultimate Sith, fulfilling their long-brewing plan. Because of Qui-Gon and his untimely death from the events that he actualized, the defensive philosophy of Obi-Wan that he adopted post-Naboo was fully maximized against Anakin in their duel on Mustafar. His tragic victory ensured that Vader's potential was stifled and limited by the cybernetics Palpatine employed to keep him alive. It also ensured that Anakin's children were safe and kept away from him so that years later they could go on to free the galaxy and begin the revival of the Jedi and the Galactic Republic. However, the cost of undoing much of the bloodshed and destruction Anakin left in his wake during his time as Darth Vader meant that the Skywalker twins and his father had very little time to care for a young Ben Solo, who struggles with his immense power and limited knowledge of his family history left him alienated and vulnerable like his grandfather decades before. Already struggling with the voices in his head, Ben finding out the truth of his family lineage at the same time as the entire galaxy made him convinced that he was suppressing who he ultimately was, and that the only course of action was to surpass and be more powerful than Vader ever was. If Qui-Gon had not forced the Jedi Council's hand, the entire events of the Skywalker saga would not have come to pass, and the persona of Kylo Ren would never have raised the galaxy just like his grandfather before him. While the family ultimately redeems itself time and time again and helps to save the galaxy, Qui-Gon's so-called prophecy also ensured that the galaxy would never know long periods of peace as long as a Skywalker by blood lived. With that groundwork laid out, I want to remind y'all of how these videos work. There will be 3 categories that both fighters will be analyzed for, which are weapon abilities, special abilities, and other traits. After comparing the 3, I will present a specially crafted scenario for how a hypothetical fight could go down between the 2 gifted and radical fighters. Now, let's get into it. For the first category, I will look at their weapon abilities, which are lightsaber focused. I'd like to note that much of what we know of both men is currently limited to the last few years of their lives across all forms of Star Wars media in 2022. We don't really know much about Ben Solo, so it felt more appropriate for me to call him Kylo Ren while still mentioning some of his light side deeds and skills. In all likelihood, Qui-Gon's earlier life will more than likely be very minimally expanded, as we don't need much more than what his character provides to the story in The Phantom Menace and onwards. To begin, Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber skills are primarily limited to a single on-screen appearance during the events of The Phantom Menace. We see his skill in deflecting blaster fire in Tales of the Jedi, but much of his canon and book material is focused on his other traits and skills. In The Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon showcases a martial arts-based prowess to his lightsaber combat, but one that is in obvious decline. When he is not cutting down the scores of battle droids, we see him fighting against the uber-aggressive Maul in two separate duels. A practitioner of Form 4, Ataru, Qui-Gon took up the acrobatic and aggressive lightsaber form while under the tutelage of Dooku. As a result of his apprenticeship, Qui-Gon was deemed an elite lightsaber duelist, even as he approached his 50s. However, even though he held his own versus Maul during their first duel on Tatooine, Qui-Gon was clearly already pushed by the younger Zabrak warrior. In their second and final matchup, Qui-Gon Jinn gave a much stronger performance during the fight in the Theed generator room and hangar, but much of it can be attributed to Darth Maul having to face a very young and aggressive duelist in Kenobi at the same time. While Jinn worked well in unison with his apprentice, Jinn also took a strong kick from Maul in the hangar and fought conservatively, as Obi-Wan took the lead offensive role. Once Maul kicked Obi-Wan off a walkway, Qui-Gon quickly became more physical and employed two quick punches to knock Maul off the walkway as well, and then proceeded to fight Maul more aggressively on his own. While he certainly displayed his skill in forcing Maul back, the pace of the fight clearly strained the Jedi Master. Once both fighters entered the pit, Maul took advantage of the narrow circular design of the walkway, which worked against the Ataru style and only added to Jinn's exhaustion and forced the older man back. With a quick feint and butt to the head, Maul stabbed Qui-Gon and dealt a fatal blow. While losing to a young Maul is nothing to sneeze at, it's obvious that Qui-Gon was no longer an elite duelist over long periods of time, especially if faced against a fighter with greater energy, physicality, and acrobatics than himself. When considering his raw talent and the scavenged remains of the lightsaber forms his uncle taught, Kylo Ren was a duelist for all ages and eras. While he could never surpass his uncle's self-taught skill in combat, he still was a master swordsman well before he fell to the dark side and began his apprenticeship to Snoke. Much of his lightsaber combat before the sequel trilogy is found in the pages of the Rise of Kylo Ren miniseries, where he easily takes on multiple Jedi apprentices and ultimately defeats Ren, the leader of the Knights of Ren, by utilizing Jar Kai. During the course of the sequel trilogy, Kylo showcases a versatile and radical fighting style. While he mirrored his uncle and grandfather in how they employed Form 5, Gem So, and their physically enriched counterattacks, Kylo frequently employed a single-hand grip to provide himself flexibility and rotational variety, which is all the more effective when considering his tri-bladed lightsaber with Quillon blades that mimic the ancient lightsabers found on Malachor. During his two duels in The Force Awakens on Starkiller Base against Finn and Rey, Ren used powerful and quick one-hand strikes when attacking the respective fighters, both to push them back and to displace the Skywalker lightsaber they fought with from their defensive stances. Once he had managed to throw off their balance, he shifted to a two-hand grip on his saber and often spun his body to add acceleration to his strikes for maximum damage to their bodies. While he easily defeated Finn, the shock of Rey force-pulling the lightsaber towards herself and her subsequent errant strikes did unbalance Kylo, but he quickly adjusted and dominated the next stretch of the fight. He employed his single and double-handed strikes and added in a lightsaber lock only his lightsaber was capable of pulling off, to push Rey to the literal edge. But subsequently, he lost his composure and advantage when she called on the Force and pushed him back, ultimately being spared by the planet breaking apart. It is fair to note that while Kylo Ren did lose the second fight, he had at this point run across the planet and had already defeated one duelist with a bowcaster shot to the side of his abdomen, and he almost pulled off the sweep if not for Rey throwing him off balance twice with her drawing on the Force. While he didn't fight in a lightsaber duel in The Last Jedi, he did take on 2 to 4 Praetorian guards at the same time in Snoke's throne room aboard the Supremacy, where he further displayed lightsaber locks, reverse grips, Jar Kai, and some punches and kicks, though he did eventually require Rey throwing him the Skywalker lightsaber to escape a blade headlock. He employed massive two-hand swings and reverse grip strikes in a short-lived duel with Luke's force projection as well, though the older man's force projection easily dodged them. A year later, during the events of The Rise of Skywalker, Kylo had become much better at dodging lightsaber strikes while unarmed, which he employed in his Force-connected duel on Kijima with Rey on his quarters on the Steadfast, and made less use of two-handed strikes, as Rey herself began to mimic his style more and more. In his final duel with Rey, aboard the Death Star 2 wreckage on Kef Bir, he reacted well to her own variation of the single to two-hand strikes that he employed, before switching entirely to a two-hand grip for maximum locking and batted strikes against her. After his redemption, Ben Solo switched back to a significantly more Ataru-based lightsaber form, combining force pushes with unconventional leaps and lightsaber locks to quickly defeat the Knights of Ren. While Qui-Gon Jinn is no slouch, he simply would fare poorly against Kylo Ren at any point in his life. As a dedicated practitioner of Ataru, his dueling philosophy and tactics centered around an aggressive and acrobatic total offense, leading towards quick victory. As discussed in my last Versus episode, Ben Solo was trained by Luke Skywalker, who scavenged together the traditional lightsaber forms and became a skilled duelist, pulling from both his experiences and his studies of past Jedi. While much of Luke's refinement in his lightsaber dueling began after his duels with his father in the original trilogy, his showcase in the Mandalorian Season 2 finale, as well as comic and book descriptions of his dueling, would suggest that he became an old-time duelist by the time of Ben's fall to the dark side. It isn't too far of a stretch to suggest that Ben had already mastered the continuous switching between the one- and two-hand grips in his lightsaber dueling, combined with his force abilities, to become an extremely skilled Ataru-based duelist. But once he trained under Snoke, and further studied Vader and Anakin, his switch to a more grounded, formified Jem So, with his imposing physicality and unconventional grips, made him even more suited for longer and more physically taxing fights. So regardless of which traditional form he would lean on in a hypothetical duel, Kylo Ren would quickly outclass Qui-Gon. For our next category, I will look at their special abilities, their force powers. It's almost unfair to compare Qui-Gon and Kylo, what with how intrinsically special Kylo is with his force bond with Rey, on top of being part of the Skywalker bloodline. However, Qui-Gon's pre and post The Phantom Menace dives into learning about the cosmic and living force and how he manifested as a force spirit opens the door to him to being more than a match for Kylo. When he was still alive, Qui-Gon Jinn amplified his martial skills and steadying presence through subtle and mostly non-violent demonstrations of the Force. Throughout his encounters with the Trade Federation droids, the Jedi Master frequently employed force pushes in addition to cutting down the machines. When faced with the droidicas on the Trade Federation control ship, the senior Jedi and his apprentice employed force speed to quickly escape down a corridor and keep the two Jedi on track to reaching the bridge. Obi-Wan's fondness for the Jedi mind trick stems from his old master, who employed the trick successfully on Boss Nass of the Gungan people, but failed to affect the mind of the junk dealer Watto on Tatooine. He did, however, use telekinesis to alter Watto's dice roll and free Anakin. After buying time for Anakin to board the Naboo cruiser, a tired Qui-Gon was still more than capable of jumping up tens of feet into the air and onto the cruiser's entry ramp. While most of these force abilities would not necessarily distinguish Qui-Gon from other Jedi of his time, his willingness to use the Force subtly and unexpectedly to follow the will of the Force could have led to unexpected opportunities throughout the Jedi Master's life. With how Obi-Wan employed the Force in a similar vein to his old master, it's also not a stretch to state that Qui-Gon probably had at or near the same strength in Force power. It is truly still his achievement in becoming a Force spirit, as taught by the Force priestesses, that sets him apart from most Force users. While it took until the Obi-Wan Kenobi series for us to see him go from a disembodied voice with lights to a full-fledged spirit, Qui-Gon could also be potentially able to interact with the natural world much like Yoda does on Acto during the events of The Last Jedi. If that were a real possibility for Qui-Gon as well, there are certain scenarios where Qui-Gon couldn't maximize his unique connection to the Force. Kylo Ren is a more traditional Force user in the sense that most of his abilities service his personality and more violent desires quite well, but his raw power and his Force bond with Rey make him one of the closest in strength to Anakin Skywalker. During the events of the rise of Kylo Ren, Ben Solo was able to crush his hut on top of himself and Luke, before later showcasing his ability to lift fellow Jedi up and hurl fiery debris with his mind. He was also able to affect weather patterns, as seen with the conjuring of the thunderclouds and red lightning that destroyed Luke's temple and killed most of the students inside. As powerful as he was, a glaring weakness of Kylo Ren's was his need to have a strong concentration and state of mind. Things that he could typically do effortlessly, like lifting up his fellow Padawans, became a struggle when he was slightly emotionally conflicted and unable to concentrate, such as when he tries to levitate Bo after pushing her off a cliff during their duel on El Forna. During the events of The Force Awakens, hiding his face under the mask allowed for Kylo to stay sharply focused, as demonstrated by his ability to use the Force stasis to freeze both Poe and his blaster shot, and have a heightened Force sense that was strong enough to sense Finn's change in behavior and to be subsequently identified. He employed Force stasis on Rey quite easily on Takodana as well, while also manipulating her arm to point her blaster away from him. His interrogation skills were violent and painful, as he could forcibly extract information from even the strongest-willed people, as seen in his scene with Poe. He could also force people to fall unconscious, as seen with Rey during her capture on Takodana. His power and abilities became hampered once more when he tried to invade Rey's mind, unknowingly activating their Force bond and leaving him shocked and unbalanced by her raw strength and by her understanding of his fears of never living up to Vader. His interactions with Rey continued to worsen, as his inability to force pull the Skywalker lightsaber to himself after having just defeated Finn left him temporarily unbalanced. As he began to dominate the fight and was poised to push Rey off a crumbling ledge, she connected more fully with the Force, and Kylo was left scrambling on his haunches as Rey marched him down and eventually sliced his face. This weakness and utilizing the Force could more than likely be attributed to Kylo constantly hardening his body through the Force to counter the bowcaster shot from Chewbacca, which was demonstrated in film as being able to blow stormtroopers off their feet and through their armor. He also can telekinetically control people across large swaths of space, much like his grandfather. With all these abilities and training under both Luke and Snoke, Kylo Ren is clearly a mighty Force user. But being part of a Force dyad also allowed for Kylo to learn and adapt abilities from Rey near instantly. While the bond served more as the only outlet for connection inside a mind shaped by isolation and decades-long misery for Kylo during The Last Jedi, he does effectively convince Rey and the mind-probing Snoke that he plans to kill her. In The Rise of Skywalker, the once more rekindled bond allowed the two to duel and touch each other more fully than they could in The Last Jedi, which allowed Kylo to realize that Rey was on his Star Destroyer quarters when they destroyed Vader's mask. The subsequent duel on Kef Bir showcased how rapidly the bond between the two had grown, with each Force jump and Force freeze on the other's lightsabers, keeping the duel evenly matched until Kylo began to beat Rey down through sheer physicality. While each draw from the other's emotions thanks to being parts of a Force dyad, upon Ben Solo's redemption, they were even able to share items and techniques across time and space, as Rey handed over the Skywalker lightsaber to Ben Solo, who truly lived up to his namesake, taking down the Knights of Ren, and Ben Solo channeled his remaining life force to heal Rey from her encounter with Sidious. Both Qui-Gon and Kylo showcase Force knowledge and abilities that transcend and affect the mortal plane of existence in tantalizing ways. But Kylo certainly has an edge over Qui-Gon once more. The ability to endure extreme amounts of pain and use unique Force abilities allows Kylo to be truly unpredictable. Plus, the Force bond with Rey allows him to constantly learn new abilities, maintain his focus, and transport objects. There are certain instances where Qui-Gon could outclass Kylo's power, but for the most part, his Force powers as a mortal do not serve him more than to keep his distance from Kylo if they were to engage in a fight. In the final category, I will look at other traits that could affect my scenario. While Qui-Gon doesn't necessarily have any notable technical or diplomatic skills out of the ordinary, his mentality in staying in the present and belief in seeking balance could serve him well in a matchup against a very unstable foe like Kylo Ren. As he told Anakin just before his pod race, Qui-Gon truly believed that your focus dictated your reality, which stood in opposition to how other Jedi placed their trust in meditation on the future and serving the Republic. He also found it difficult to reconcile with the Jedi being on Coruscant, as he viewed them as having given up their true purpose by becoming subservient to the government. While he was not focused on the literal readings of the prophecies as he was during his early years, he did respect them and value their contribution to the greater idea of Jedi finding balance between the rigid beliefs of their order while not bending to the dark side. In this matchup, he would respect the will of the Force manifesting itself with Kylo Ren being part of a fabled Force dyad. Even if he kickstarted the generational trauma that resulted in the man standing before him, he would keep his focus on the present, balanced and ready for what was in front of him, and everything else as auxiliary. On the other hand, Kylo Ren is a gifted pilot, with the combination of his mother's Force ability passed down to him, combined with the reflexes and piloting skill of his father. As such, he has a legendary ability to fly ships. He demonstrated his skill with both ship flying and combat during his escape from Ossus after the destruction of his uncle's temple, where he rendered his fellow Padawans' engines inoperable while evading them during their chase, without lethal implication, due to his precise accuracy. After his fall to the dark side, He ravaged anyone in his path when he was in a ship, as exemplified by his destruction of the Radis's hangar and the defenses, save for when he hesitated to shoot down his mother. He was gifted in mechanics, as he often pushed the limits of his ships through tinkering and kept his lightsaber in crude form for easy modifications to add to its chaotic and unpredictable visage. But he was also known to collect Force artifacts and write his thoughts and learnings on the Force in calligraphy, showcasing a dedication to truly learning all things about the Force. It's hard to compare these two Force users with their very different sensibilities and skills, and the general lack of depth outside of their on-screen appearances. However, I do think Kylo's need for keeping up appearances to be intimidating and scary would be easily torn apart by Qui-Gon's perceptiveness, in much the same way he understood who the real queen was and who was a handmaiden from Naboo at all times during the events of the Phantom Menace. With Kylo Ren leading 2 out of the 3 categories, will the scenario play out in his favor? Will Qui-Gon Jinn be completely outclassed and stand no chance? Find out in my scenario. Like with my Luke and Obi-Wan versus, Qui-Gon and Kylo Ren are separated by a greater gap in their ages, including having no crossover for when they were both alive. However, since this matchup is most appealing because of their relationship to the beginning and the ending of the Skywalker saga, a neutral ground where time and space does not have to factor into their lives is most optimal. Though it is hinted that the redeemed Ben Solo reunited with his mother in the Force, we do not know if he can become a spirit like Qui-Gon and the others, or even if that information found in the novelization of The Rise of Skywalker necessarily holds much weight for future Star Wars content with sequel-era characters and storylines. There is an intriguing location that does hold value to the Skywalkers and those closest to them, that would allow both duelists to remain as mortals and to face each other. While it would be interesting to see the two fighters duel in the world between worlds, there is a better option here that is still connected in some ways, and that would be Mortis. There have been debates whether Mortis is a special Force-strong planet, a manifestation of the Force, or just a wild meta sandbox sort of dream. And I honestly think it's a mix of them all. In this scenario, Kylo Ren would be attempting to search for Rey during the events of The Rise of Skywalker, after having just found out about her true birthright and the power that he could take back from the resurrected Sidious on Exegol. After departing from the Red Honeycomb Maze, Kylo would stumble upon the Mortis monolith. He would attempt to fly his TIE Whisper away from the monolith, with his focus currently on Rey and taking greater power and control over the galaxy. But then he would suddenly black out. Kylo would then wake up on the planet itself and attempt to contact the Knights of Ren, and when failing to reach them, the First Order's Supreme Council. Hearing nothing from both parties, Kylo would then disembark and walk through the ever-shifting planet. As it turned dark and the plants died, he would glimpse a pale man with red eyes keeping his distance. As it turned bright and life blossomed, he would see a peculiar owl overhead, landing on a tree next to a beautiful woman with green hair. Looking to see if the red-eyed man was nearby and closing him in, Kylo would find no one. The green-haired woman would beckon to him, calling on him to wordlessly follow her. Try as he might, the pull of her light would make him drag his feet forward, entering into a dark cavern illuminated by an altar surrounded by green wispy fire, with the strange woman watching him wordlessly. Sensing the altar's power, Kylo would immediately walk towards it, reaching out for a blade protruding from the middle of it. Just as he's about to touch the handle, the green fire and blade would wink out, and the woman would vanish. From the opposite end of the cavern, Kylo would hear footsteps and activate his lightsaber, anticipating an enemy strike. Instead, the Force spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn would appear. Kylo would question the man, who would tell him that he is Qui-Gon Jinn, and the woman he had followed was the visage of the daughter, a powerful female Force wielder of an unknown species who had died decades ago in Kylo's plane of existence. Qui-Gon would then bemusedly question why a self-proclaimed Dark Lord and Supreme Commander would not have pursued the man with the red eyes, who he names as the Son, or at least what remains of him. Angered by the man's perceived deception and mockery, Kylo would once more ask who the man really was, and Qui-Gon's form would change to that of himself just before the events of the Phantom Menace, seemingly made of flesh and bone. Qui-Gon's good humor would immediately fade, answering to Kylo that he was the man truly responsible for all of his suffering, having just found out that Sidious was behind all the voices in his head throughout his life. An addition to that list would enrage Kylo, who would swing wildly down at the man with a single hand strike from his lightsaber. Almost out of nowhere, Qui-Gon would deflect the blade fully, with his own green blade shimmering against the chaotic exhaust of Kylo's own. Forced to switch to a two-hand grip, Kylo would push the older man away from him and attempt to use the Force stasis technique on him, in hopes of then being able to torture someone who may have caused additional pain on top of what he had already faced throughout his life. Qui-Gon would nearly instantaneously dash away with the Force speed technique. Forced to follow the man's general direction, Kylo would sprint after him, before barely stopping himself at the edge of a large chasm, the Well of the Dark Side. Peering down, he would see Qui-Gon, waiting for him to descend. Jumping straight into the chasm, Kylo would attempt to strike the man using the speed of his fall, but Qui-Gon would force push him several feet away just as Kylo makes contact. Kylo would quickly attempt to readjust and rush towards Qui-Gon, but would then be forced back by the Ataru Master Swordsman, suddenly deploying kicks and punches in between an all-out acrobatic assault with his lightsaber. Qui-Gon would push Kylo to the limit, whose defense would remain stout, before attempting to jump away from the long exchange for a brief respite. Kylo would then immediately jump and grab the leaping man's free hand, throwing the Master Jedi down to the ground, hurting him, and dislodging his lightsaber from his other hand. Pulling the green lightsaber to his other free hand, Kylo would attempt to put Qui-Gon's head in between the two lightsabers, ready to get his answers and to feed the swirling turbulence that he could never truly satiate. Qui-Gon would then look up at Kylo and smile, congratulating him on his victory in battle, before pausing, and then telling him that he knows Kylo's turbulence would be far less if he were still connected to the girl. Stunned, Kylo would struggle to say anything, his emotions getting the best of him even more, and he would inadvertently form clouds over the chasm. He would shift his attention to the storm and try to dismiss it, when suddenly a lightning bolt would strike down at Qui-Gon and blast away Kylo. Stumbling back to his feet, Kylo would find Qui-Gon standing unscathed, only this time in his Force Spirit form. Enraged, Kylo would scream his frustrations at the old Jedi Master, questioning why he was here when he was at the cusp of all he wanted, how he knew of Rey, and why he felt the need to toy with his understandings of his life. Qui-Gon would smile at the man, telling him to trust his instincts, to feel, and to not think, and in doing so, the deeper answers would reveal themselves to him. As he would slow down his breathing, smoke would begin to swirl all around Kylo, who would then witness the painful memories of his life in reverse order, from his recent encounter with Sidious, all the way to his earliest memories of piloting the Falcon with his father and Chewbacca. Kylo would attempt to close his eyes, but Qui-Gon would urge the man to see what he had already faced and to better learn why he became who he is now. Keeping his eyes open, Kylo would begin to see flashes of his extended family's memories, such as that of his uncle's struggles against and for his grandfather, of his mother's horror at her connection, of Obi-Wan's tortured exile due to his failure, of his grandfather's tragic fall, and finally of Qui-Gon's death at the hands of Maul, leaving Anakin unable to fulfill the desire he shared with Qui-Gon to see and go to all the planets and stars one day, and Qui-Gon's subsequent desire to train and adapt the young man to become the most effective version of the Chosen One for the galaxy. Stunned by the unfolding of his family history, and how generations of his family and galactic trauma would never have come to exist if not for the untimely passing of Qui-Gon, Kylo would ask why Qui-Gon felt it was the time to now reach out to him, and not at any period of time before. Qui-Gon would answer that the young man's entire life had been shaped up to this point by the legacy of his own untimely passing and its ripple effects on those closest to him, and that Sidious had helped craft much of Kylo's personal downfall and as close as a version possible to his grandfather's in order to entirely undo the Chosen One's final victory. While he has no real say on whether the prophecy of the Chosen One is any more true than it was when he first encountered it, the Force dyad between Kylo and Rey was something entirely real. How Kylo reconnected with Rey would determine whether his future was entirely his or an additional chapter to a story Sidious had twisted and manipulated on so many levels up to this point. By helping the man formerly known as Ben to understand the real history of his family legacy that had weighed him down his entire life, Qui-Gon would admit that he believes he could ensure Kylo could find clarity and true balance in his life upon his eventual reconnection with Rey, which would also serve as the smallest bit of an apology that he could provide to a man at the end of all the dominoes he first caused to fall. Taking it all in, Kylo would smile, and then violently call his lightsaber to his hand and cut through Qui-Gon's spirit, claiming that learning from his past on a deeper level only further reinforced the need to shape the galaxy and the Force in a way only he and Rey could understand and benefit from. After dispensing of Jinn's spirit, Kylo would awaken from his slumber on a ship, still outside the Red Honeycomb Zone, and without the Mortis monolith to be found. He would then depart for a Star Destroyer, ready to begin his reconnection to Rey. Back on Mortis, Qui-Gon's spirit would reappear, remarking to himself that while Kylo had rejected his apology and advice, the will of the Force would eventually rebalance and redeem the man who had managed to defeat him rather easily in a duel, as unbalanced and disconnected from his Force spawn as he was at that point in time. Hey everyone, this is Sanak. I just want to thank you guys for watching the third episode of my Star Wars Lads vs. series between Qui-Gon Jinn and Kylo Ren. I know in my last duel with Luke and Obi-Wan, I didn't have a very clear-cut winner, but I tried my best to make sure that it's pretty abundantly clear that Kylo Ren / Ben Solo would win in any sort of duel against Qui-Gon Jinn, as wonderful as a Jedi as he is. I think a lot of y'all will agree with my points here, but if you have some supporting or very differing thoughts on this scenario in this duel, make sure to comment them down below. And if you haven't already, make sure to also like on this video. It's the best way we can get our Star Wars Lads videos into the YouTube algorithm. And if you're a fan of all the content that we put out on this channel, make sure to subscribe to us as well. Currently, with Andor just being recently completed, we're shifting more towards a 2 episodes per week release schedule. But we are also starting our gaming once more on the Twitch channel of ours, focused on Jedi Fallen Order as a build-up towards Jedi Survivor. So be on the lookout for the schedule for that coming very soon. If you're an audio podcast fan, you can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and many other podcast platforms out there. If you want to stay up to date with us, make sure to follow us on our social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Thanks again for watching this video.